Okay, I believe we are all live now. So welcome to the Climate Action Race to Net Zero webinar. Over the next hour, we're going to be picking up lots of helpful practical tips about how to tackle your net zero challenge. Before we start, it's probably just worth pointing out that you can't open a paper or click on a link nowadays without running into this phrase net zero. Yet a few short years ago, it was hardly in the mainstream. So it's interesting just briefly to reflect how come it's sprung out of the shadows of green wonkdom, as it were, and it's become such a commonplace. And I think really there are probably two answers to that. One is obviously the climate crisis has become more urgent, but also it's just the simplicity of the idea of net zero. And when you think compared to a lot of sustainability speak with its talk of theories of system change and just and regenerative transitions and all these things that can really sound quite ancient Greek to people who are outside the green bubble, as it were, net zero, it sounds easy to grasp. It's got that sort of brisk, robust ring to it. You know, by X date, we will be responsible for zero net emissions. Done. You know, if you define a net zero target, you can't help but come over as decisive and robust, which is catnip to any CEO or government minister. So it's hardly surprising that it has become almost the minimum commitment required from any company, any organization seeking to be seen as somebody who takes their climate responsibilities seriously. But what does it mean in practice? If you're hearing this webinar, you're probably wrestling already with just that question, or maybe that should be questions plural, like what emissions are we offsetting? Is it scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, i.e. those emissions that are not under your direct control, emissions from your supply chain, emissions from your customers, emissions from your products or services in use? Are you allowed to offset? And if so, how do you offset? And how much of your emissions is it okay to offset? What's your target date? 2050, 2030? Extinction Rebellion say 2025. Are they mad or are they appropriately aspirational given the scale of the task? And should you set a target that you don't know how to achieve? We'll be exploring all those questions. We'll also be running some polls to get your views on some of those questions as we go through. You'll certainly have your own queries, so do input them to us. Do put them in the Q&As. And I think you're all anonymous unless you want to be otherwise, I believe. So don't worry if you're quite provocative with your questions. But what about some answers? We have got a panel who are knee-deep in experience of wrestling with this stuff. And so they're well equipped to come up with some helpful insights, bring you up to speed. To introduce them in turn, we have David Ireland, OBE, who will now wave at you. There he is. David is Director of World Habitat. So he's a specialist in housing. He was voted one of the 50 most influential people in the sector by readers of Housing 24 magazine a few years ago. And as well as housing, he's also got experience of foundations and the way foundations approach climate challenges such as this. So he's able to draw on his experience of that also. Then we have Althea Solomon, who will now wave at us in case it's not obvious who Althea Solomon is. Althea is the strategy manager for carbon and climate change at Severn Trent Water. So she's at the sharp end of one of the UK's major utilities adoption of a net zero target. And I believe Severn Trent has set a target, at least for its own emissions, of 2030 for net zero, which is appropriately challenging. So we're hearing more from Althea in a tick on that. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Whitty, who's head of business development at Planet Mark, which helps organizations measure and reduce their carbon and other impacts. And Jonathan's particularly strong on that thorny issue of scope 3 emissions. So I'm going to be asking our panelists each in turn to give a brief introduction, a few thoughts themselves, some insights of what they've discovered in their own net zero journey. and then I'll follow up with a few questions. We'll stab the first of our polls, and then we'll get to the Q&As or the Qs from yourselves. So if I may, I'll kick off with David. David.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. There's a maxim which goes something like, there are no big problems, just lots of little problems. And I tend to think when it comes to carbon emissions, small organisations like mine are just one of those little problems. I'm director of World Habitat, which is a small global housing charity and foundation. We operate programmes around the world and international housing competition in partnership with UN Habitat. I tend to think the problem for small organisations is that our own relatively small carbon footprint appears insignificant compared to the other issues we have to deal with and compared to the size of the problem. And to be honest, there aren't really any external drivers pushing us, whether legal, tax, or even reputational, pushing us to address it. So it's all too easy not to do anything. This may sound counterintuitive, but I think there's also a further problem in being a charity. The traditional thinking is that charities are all about their charitable purpose. As long as the charity is doing good, the little problems that you cause along the way can be gently ignored. I think this thinking is beginning to change, but nevertheless, it still exists. And both these reasons, scale and charitable purpose, I think provide a ready-made excuse for not worrying too much about carbon. Patently, these excuses are not good enough. As a charity, as any organisation, we ought to be defined by our values and ought to seek to leave the world in a better place than we found it. And in my view, I don't see how that's compatible with not addressing our contributions to the climate emergency. We started our journey about 4 years ago by starting off by measuring our own emissions and setting a target to reach net zero by 2030. The measuring gave us a pretty clear indication of what we needed to do. Martin talked about scope 1, 2 and 3. Scope 1, we found we didn't have any. We don't emit any directly. We don't burn any fossil fuels directly ourselves. Scope 2, there's not really too much either, and it's pretty easy to address. But our problem is scope 3. 97% of our emissions are in scope 3, and the bulk of that is flying people around the world to see our housing programmes. Our aim of becoming net zero by 2030, I think, is achievable, and we hope to do it sooner. And that means cutting our scope 3 by at least 50%. What we found the first couple of years is actually efficiency savings is quite easy. You can knock off 10 or 20% quite without any particular problems. But pretty soon the opportunities disappear, and you have to get into fundamentally rethinking what the business is all about and how it does it. For us, that has meant developing an international network of associates who are in country and can carry out our work for us to save us from having to fly people around. This year, instead of 150 tonnes, we're on course for less than 20. Hopefully the road we're on takes us from being a little problem to being a little bit of the solution.
Excellent. Thank you, David. That's a nice overview for us. Moving on, Althea, how is net zero for you?
Hi, thanks, Martin. So I work for a wastewater and water company in the Midlands, and we serve around 11 million customers. So as you can probably imagine, treating and pumping water is pretty energy intensive. And the UK water industry emitted 2.4 megatons of carbon in the 1920 year. So it's pretty significant stuff. This has actually dropped by 45% since 2011. So we've already been making great strides into reducing this, but just in the very nature of water, it's just big volumes and big weight to move around the country. So at Severn Trent, we've been reducing our carbon emissions year on year for sort of 14 years now, and it's very much been sort of central and growing bigger and bigger all the time as to sort of how important it is for us. The nature of our business gives us some particularly interesting challenges and opportunities, I think. So touch on a couple of the opportunities. First of all, we use anaerobic digestion to treat our sewage sludge. We've had to treat it to fairly high standards over the years, and this has given us the opportunity to produce renewable power from it, which means that we're now producing over 50% of our energy needs ourselves, which is fantastic from renewable sources. Another opportunity is we're actually very big landholders across the Midlands, and that's become more and more relevant recently as we've realised the potential that we have in our land, both to reduce carbon and to deliver wider benefits to our local communities. But we've also got significant challenges in that our wastewater treatment processes actually release a lot of greenhouse gases. So we have particularly methane and nitrous oxide that just from the biological processes we use to treat wastewater are being released into the atmosphere. These have been pretty hard to measure, let alone sort of then resolve. So we've got some pretty significant scope 1 challenges ahead of us. So back in 2019, the UK water industry came together and we set collective targets of getting to net zero by 2030 in terms of our operational emissions, so mostly scope 1 and scope 2. Severn Trent's particular take on this was to set our triple pledge, which is that we'll have 100% of our energy coming from renewable sources, we'll have 100% of our vehicles powered by electricity or an alternative solution if electricity can't work for larger vehicles, and that we'll get the net zero position by 2030. Having got that established, we then decided we needed to turn our attention to scope 3. So we've now set science-based targets as well. This gives us the kind of validation that our sort of efforts to reduce are in line with the 1.5 trajectory, and also then has really focused us on the sort of supply chain and other areas of our business. So we've had many challenges around the scope 3 area, not least understanding just what our scope 3 emissions are, because they are broad and very varied. We have so many suppliers. We engage in construction work, we have a lot of employees, a lot of customers. So it's been a significant challenge, even just getting hold of the data to understand it, let alone start to reduce it. But we're on that journey now, and it's been fantastic to see the turnaround, I'd say, even within sort of the last year, 18 months, within our business of trying to address this, and our suppliers coming on the journey with us.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Althea. And it's sort of fortuitous that you finished talking about scope 3, because I think that's the specialist subject of Jonathan, who's going to come on next. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. So hi, I'm Jonathan. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to have so many people joining us this afternoon. I work for the Planet Mark. I've been a sustainability consultant for the last 10 years or so, and it's been really, heartening to see the focus on net zero now and solving the climate crisis that I think we've experienced in the last couple of years. 2019 being a bit of a pivotal year with the Greta Thunberg effect and the Extinction Rebellion and all of that good stuff. And now we're seeing a bit of a snowball effect in the build up to COP. And the Planet Mark itself, which Martin just touched on, we help companies measure and reduce carbon. That's what we do. Interestingly, David, World Habitat, you certified with us recently. I was having a look at your report earlier, which is really exciting. And then most recently, we're helping companies get to net zero and set really credible net zero science-based targets and the strategies that sit behind them. From a scope 3 perspective, which I refer to fondly as the frontier of carbon footprinting right now, with scope 1 and scope 2. Most companies having a relatively good handle on it if you are starting to measure your carbon footprint with your direct fuel consumption. And I think Althea really nicely touched on it. It's all about data and getting hold of quantified, credible data to help you build a really informative carbon footprint that you can start to reduce from year on year. It's relentless. It's a relentless thing. And scope 3, if I could just get you, for those that don't know, it covers 15 categories. Downstream scope 3 and upstream scope 3. Now there's categories where the data should be relatively available to work from. So things like business travel, your waste data, you have a legal obligation to know how much waste you're generating, where it's going. Water consumption, you should, if you're in serviced offices, it becomes more challenging, but you can work with your landlord, but should be relatively easy to get hold of. The most tricky one that we are experiencing is what we call purchase goods and services. And if we break it down even further, if you're a service-based organization, it's less challenging. Whereas if you're a manufacturing-based organization in the primary sector, your purchase goods and services for those products that you're making and selling, and then if you go downstream, the end of life and use of those products, that is where we're at, and that is incredibly challenging because you're needing to work with your suppliers to understand the exact carbon associated with all the different components that go into making your product that then you're selling on to your customers. And then you're responsible for the end of life of those products, and legislation's coming through. With service-based organizations, it's still really challenging. And we break, so at the Planet Mark, we break down supply chain, understanding upstream supply chain by spend. So 80%, we want to capture 80% of your supply chain by spend. And you've got to be actively engaging those suppliers to see what kind of data you can get hold of, minimum quantities and distance traveled to yourselves in order to get those supplies to you. And then you've got to try and get hold of tangible data, which is really, really hard. If you can't get hold of it, there are some amazing databases out there now where we can build estimates around what your carbon footprint is. But in order to reach net zero, you have to be measuring your full scope 3, which is really hard. And we have to put pressure on suppliers to be going through life cycle assessments of their products to be able to easily supply companies data so they can understand what their full scope 3 is. But we're at this, that's why I call it the forefront. This is the edge of where we are. Even the Marks and Spencers of this world are finding it really challenging to understand, their full scope 3 upstream supply chain around purchased goods and services. So we have to be really active in this space to say we need to be collaborating to get hold of the data that we need to make these informed decisions and build as accurate a carbon footprint as we can for our organizations. So then we know where to focus our efforts and our energies to continue to reduce every year.
So thanks, Jonathan. Before we do our first poll, just at the risk of sounding like I'm oversimplifying what is a hugely complex task, if you're somebody just setting out on the journey, you've got a corporate commitment to do net zero, you're just setting out on it, what would be your sort of bluffer's guide, your sort of straightforward practical tips? And any of you, it might be Jonathan or either of you, what are the first 5 things, whatever I do on Monday morning as I set out to set my net zero target or to operationalize a net zero target? To be more precise, I think.
So for me, it's the age-old saying of, you can't manage what you don't measure type situation, right? So we've got to go through that quantification process. If you haven't started it yet, it is really easy and simple once you start to wrap your head around it. And all of that data, as I said at the beginning, should be readily available. It sits within your bills and it sits within the landlord's information that they should be giving to you. And then start working out, start with your scope 1 and 2 and build out those scope 3s that you do have data available for. And then I'm going to let everyone else speak, so I don't want to hog the space. So I will stop there and let anyone else contribute to this.
So start making sure you've measured. Yeah.
Measurement is key.
Yeah.
I just found just a quick tip for measuring. I mean, we've got a very simple organisation compared to others we've spoken about here, but and it may be I'm just blessed with great staff, but finance people just take to this really easily, and it is a form of accountancy. It's different units from traditional accountancy, but actually so many of the principles are the same. They've got an eye for it, and also most of the information which you need in order to measure is actually coming through your finance people anyway. So they've actually got the information to hand. So we found actually we didn't need to go out and get lots of external advice at first. Actually, we got really good people in-house who are able to adapt to it really quickly.
Thanks. Althea, anything to add just on the practicalities from your point of view? What you have to do on Monday morning?
Yes, so I'd say try not to do it all by yourself. Again, particularly we've got a large organisation, but each person we really get on board with this journey, it just helps spreading that load and get ideas from your colleagues. You don't sort of have to solve it all yourselves. There's so many people who are now engaged in this and interested. It's really worth going out there and seeking ideas of others and just getting that commitment from them. And the other thing I think I'd say from our sort of scope 3 journey in particular, don't let the fear of the data not being good enough stop you from starting. If you're having to estimate it, it's far better than doing nothing. So start there and then work over time to improve it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just to say, the theme there I loved was, you know, people are really passionate about getting involved and taking those passions for maybe outside of the workplace and bringing them in. And actually it gives you that greater sense of purpose, which is a big buzzword at the moment around what you do. So get those passionate people involved with it. And yeah, finance people love numbers, that's for sure.
Great. We'll have our first poll in a second. It will flash up before your very eyes. And we're not being absolutely deluged with questions, to put it mildly, at the moment. So do please put your question in. Doesn't matter how naive you think it is, or indeed how complicated and sophisticated you think it is. Okay, so we've got our first poll. What's your net zero target? Do you even have one yet? So so be honest. Give us a response to that, and we will see the results flashing up on our screen even as we speak, coming through. We'll give it a little while for that to come through, for the rest of you to vote on that. We have an impressive outbreak of honesty in that no, we got a majority have got their target there, and it's a relatively ambitious one, actually. Interesting. Okay, I mean, just on target, I'd just be interested in panel's views, and say if somebody wants to follow this up with a question of their own, please do so. There was that lovely quote, I've got it here, from Caroline Lucas, Green Party ex-leader, influential environmentalist, saying, aiming to get to net zero emissions by 2050 is like dialing 999 and asking for the fire brigade to come in 30 years' time. Are we just being hopelessly unambitious with this stuff? Any thoughts on that? Severn Trent set 2030, I think, for your own emissions. That's right, isn't it, Althea?
We have, yes, and yeah, we're doing everything we can to reduce quicker than that. But some of our process and things, as I said, it takes a lot of change. It's literally changing processes that are 100 years old of how we treat our wastewater. So it's not easy. And that is our operational emissions. So we've given ourselves a bit longer to get to the zero position for scope 3. But again, we're trying to start with the engagement sooner than that and setting quite ambitious targets of a few years' time to get much of our supply chain engaged. So we're doing as much as we can, but realistically, there's a lot to do, and you can't solve it all within a couple of years. Sure.
Jonathan, you were wanting to come in.
Yeah, so there's the ambition's the key word here, and I always say, you know, you need the right balance of ambition and realism. I firmly believe that every service-based organization can get to net zero by 2030. It's not that difficult.
Including scope 3?
Including scope 3. But we have to be careful with the definition of a scope 3, right? Which is getting as close to zero as possible, and then offsetting those residual emissions through projects that actively sequester carbon from the atmosphere. But we want to get to absolute zero if we possibly can, and we need all the urgency in the world in order to do that and treat it like the crisis it is. That's first and foremost. If you're a manufacturing-based business or a Severn Trent where it's complicated, then I think there's a little bit more leeway. All companies in the UK have got to get to net zero by 2050 anyway. So you might as well take advantage of the opportunity that this is to differentiate yourselves by setting a target and then working to get there and unlocking those additional value benefits, because all your customers, they want to work with companies that are doing more good. And if you can credibly demonstrate that, you know, you're unlocking the broader business case. So it's really critical, but, you know, we've got to get on with it, and we've got to inspire other countries around us that haven't legally bound themselves to get into net zero by 2050 to do the same.
Yeah. What about the question of how you sort of define your parameters? I'm thinking of that study that the Bloomberg New Energy Foundation did, I think earlier this year, where they said, I think they analyzed 30 corporate targets for net zero, and they found that no two were the same. And they said it resembles the Wild West out there in terms of, you know, everybody makes up their own mind what net zero means for them. We're getting a couple of questions, which I'll pull in a minute, but just to finish this one, is an initiative like, for example, the Science Based Targets initiative helpful in providing a sort of rigor? I mean, if you're looking for credibility, where do you turn? How do you make sure that your net zero target is widely seen as credible?
I just think we're all learning on this, and I mean, in our organisation, we're definitely at the beginning of this journey, and I think there are things that we've already done where we've set ourselves a target and then thought actually we can do better than that, and we've replaced it, and actually Planet Mark is helping us refine that further. So I think just having something is a good start. It's one of those things, I think, if you delay it until you've got it perfect before you launch, then actually is more time wasted and more time lost, and you're better refining what you've got rather than waiting for the perfect thing to emerge.
We've actually got two questions that have come up which are related, and that's quite helpful, because we've got Eleanor asking if or when carbon offsetting isn't recognised under net zero. I think that's a big if myself, but how we look to get around that. And then somebody else asking about, what about, kind of plays to what I was just saying, what about this whole greenwash thing? The companies doing as little as possible and then saying, oh, we offset, or we buy all our electricity from a green tariff, so that's okay. I mean, is there a need for greater rigor than we have at the moment?
Yes, for sure. There needs to be a bit more stick and also a bit more carrot involved to drive the changes that we need to see. I think as we all become more informed as to what net zero really means, and with the latest publication from Science Based Targets and settling in on an agreed definition, I think that is what's going to be adopted widely and broadly. And then you've got big corporates coming out with different terms like climate positive, carbon negative, and then carbon neutrality. And for someone new into the space, trying to understand that, if you're not particularly carbon literate just yet, makes it really challenging. So that's why organisations that do know have to try and make it as simple and clear for them to understand it. But it's not that complicated once you wrap your head around it. So we need to just all settle into a groove of all agreeing what it is that we're going for. And companies are going to get caught out big time when, if they are greenwashing and are misleading people, they need transparent strategies that sit behind those net zero targets. Otherwise, investors and other external stakeholders and the general public are going to know, because we're all learning here.
Yeah. Okay, we got a couple of interesting questions coming in, but just before we go to those, let's do our second poll, which I think is going to pop up in a minute and might well be as revealing as the first one. So yes, second poll, there we are. Scope 3. So has your organization incorporated Scope 3 emissions in your net zero target? Yes, no, but we're planning. And the last one is, what's that? Which I would find that not a surprising question given the details involved. So we'll just oh, it disappeared off the screen. But we saw briefly the answers to that one. Okay, let's go to pick up another question about aviation, because that's interesting. I think one of the interesting things with net zero is how big a change is necessary. And will it be rather surprising how big a change is needed when you actually adopt such a target? So the question there about a modal shift away from aviation onto lower carbon forms of transport could drastically reduce Scope 3 emissions from essential business travel. Not sure whether that's necessarily a Scope 3 emission, actually, because if you're flying yourself, that's probably Scope 2, isn't it? Anyway, Jonathan, you're the expert, but David, Althea, please join in. Do you advise your clients to not to fly anymore?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. COVID's actually made that conversation a little bit easier, because we've demonstrated that this kind of conversation is possible. We've demonstrated a proof of concept of a more hybrid way of working. But I was on the phone with an investment bank yesterday where the CFO was like, I'm not going to ask my teams to be not flying to go see clients, because that is going to impact, business and the bottom line. And it's fairly old school. I don't want to talk about it too much, because he probably, if in case he's here, but it's a challenging conversation around behavior change and how do we achieve the same outcomes via video conferencing and flying less than going and seeing people. I think on the flip side, we've also actively learned that actually being physically present with each other is a very human thing, and it is actually quite important. So it's a balancing act, but we have to, for those service-based companies that fly a lot, in professional services and financial sector especially, if they want to take this thing seriously, they need to consider how they're going to, reduce from that perspective, which is scope 3 business travel.
Might it be that one of the things that's, I ask slightly provocatively, one of the things that's spurred by strong net zero targets might be innovation in, for example, electric aviation, algal biofuels, hydrogen powered planes and so on? Might we see that?
Yeah, I think, what was it this week? Rolls-Royce trialed their first electric engine, and that technology has a big role to play here.
Yeah.
It's just.
And do we see more generally? Do we? And David and Althea, please feel free to respond as well. Do we see more generally net zero targets actually helping drive innovation, not only across the economy, but actually within individual organizations? That a net zero target helps you do things that you would want to be doing anyway, better and quicker.
Certainly that's the case for us. Our innovation portfolio has grown hugely around the sort of carbon area, and is producing already many benefits that are much wider, even to the extent that we're looking at things that won't necessarily reduce our own carbon footprint, but in the opportunities we have in our waste stream, we have the opportunity to produce a lot of sort of renewable, effectively, products by what we can do with what actually drives to us. So we might have started looking at something to say reduce electricity use, but then you realise there are potentially much wider benefits from that, and it's really sort of in a sort of circular economy way, making us look at things a lot differently.
Excellent. David?
Yeah, Jonathan mentioned COVID, and I just think for us, this just made us implement our plans 2 or 3 years earlier than we would have done otherwise. And it's just proved to us, we were forced into a position of no flying and of video conferencing. And it all worked. All of the sort of fears that we got about we were going to lose relationships and things are not going to work anymore, actually proved not to be correct. I think there's a sort of a longer term thought about if you never actually meet people face to face, whether actually those relationships are not as deep, and actually whether that has long-term implications. And there's also, for us, I think, a lot of the staff that came to work for us came because it was an exciting place to work with lots of business travel, and suddenly that stops. It's not quite the same thing, but it works. And that, all of the fears that we had have been proved not to be anything like as bad as they had been. And now for the thing for us is making sure we don't go back into old habits as the COVID restrictions are lifted.
Yeah. Let's have a question here from Phil Clark of this parish, Global Good Awards, and it's an interesting one, talking about should some sectors, e.g. service, e.g. like I think you were saying, Jonathan, ones that are slightly easier to decarbonize, should they work harder to achieve absolute zero to balance those sectors where he says it will be nearly impossible, e.g. essential manufacturing? One thinks of, say steel and concrete as two obvious industries where they're making a lot of progress, they still struggle to achieve net zero. Should it be incumbent upon, if you're a service business, should you not be satisfied with, say, a 2040 or 2045 target? Because if you're taking your responsibility seriously, you need to set a tougher one because you can do. Any thoughts on that?
That can certainly be one of the drivers if you want to think about it that way, for sure. There should be enough there for business leaders, and this is on their watch, right, in the decade of action, to be rolling up their sleeves to say, right, 2030, what do we need to do to get this in place? And as I said before, I think any service-based business, and the evidence is there, and we're helping companies do this all the time now, including University of Greenwich, etc., where it is complicated, get to net zero by 2030. So we just need the right level of ambition. There are some cost implications, absolutely, but the return on that investment is huge, and it's just demonstrating the evidence that is the case. It'd be interesting to hear from Althea what the drivers for Severn Trent are setting that 2030 target, right? That'd be really interesting to understand. But any service-based business, B2B, B2C, we need the level of ambition, and yeah, it will help.
Althea, do you want to?
Yeah. So for us, I think we have such a big challenge. We wanted to set a near-term target so that we really got on with it quickly. We realise that we can't eliminate all our operational emissions by 2030. It's just not feasible with the amount it would cost and the technology that isn't there yet. But by at least setting a net zero, yes, we may have to offset the last remaining emissions at that point, but then we will continue working to reduce the percentage that has to be offset and continue to genuinely drive that down. But unless we set that target of 2030, we might think, 2040, ages away, and it wouldn't drive the level of activity and the amount that, honestly, the culture of our company, I'd say, is significantly different than it was 18 months ago because of this. So I think you need those near-term targets, however challenging they are, to make you get on with it.
No, that's interesting. So do we imagine, panel as a whole, that 2030 is going to virtually become the default net zero target for companies that are not heavy emitters?
I'd love to see that, and that's what we should all be pushing for and advocating for, in order to, give ourselves the best possible chance of 1.5 and then 2. So yeah, if we can.
David's nodding.
Yeah, and I'd like to see something a bit stronger from government, whether that is a legal driver or whether that is a tax driver. At the moment, it's very easy just for most small organisations to think this is just one of the other problems down the road, and we've got a whole load of other ones which are shouting louder than this one at the moment. I think once you get something from government saying actually this is the expectation, that starts to change thinking, and that's when it starts to take off. And we're just not anywhere near that at the moment.
So I want to tackle offsetting. We got an interesting question on it. I think we got a poll question on offsetting. So let's have the poll question coming up. I think we've got a poll question coming up on offsetting. Hopefully, if I press the magic button. Well, let's start off with, there we are. Yeah. Does your net zero target contain provisions for offsetting some emissions? Yes, no. Continue to review and reduce offsetting, and we haven't set a target. So let's have a vote on that, and see how those come in. And we've got so most people are offsetting, which doesn't surprise me, and some are committed to review and reduce. So Andrew Bent Marshall has asked an interesting question, really, about presumably demand for offsetting will increase rapidly over the next 10 years. That could lead to it exceeding the supply of credible offsets. So what's your advice on selecting robust offsetting options? Althea, just start with you, because you said you're going to have to offset some. Are you already offsetting, or are you keeping that sort of that arrow in the quiver ready?
We are working on everything we can do to do things with our own land. So whether that's tree planting or peat restoration. So we're going at all of that first because we believe it's going to be far better to do on our own land where we can. Yeah. As a last resort, we will purchase offsets, which we're not doing yet because, again, we're reducing everything we possibly can first in terms of emission, and it will be that last little bit at 2030 if we can't quite get there, where we'll go out and do that. So we're very much ploughing all our efforts at the moment into doing things differently ourselves, and then it'll be that end point where those last few questions.
Any recommendations, David or Jonathan? So if you've decided, obviously we're going to have to offset some, how do we decide what a credible offset is? There's no shortage of people claiming to offer good offsets at the moment.
I think we've just been on a learning curve about what offsetting is and what climate finance is as a separate thing. So we support lots of organisations around the world as a foundation who are doing fantastic things about saving carbon. There are ways in which you can build a house out of mud, which is just wheelbarrowed out the river next door, and it's almost got zero embodied energy in it. And we're funding that organisation to build more of those houses. What we were hoping is that we could develop that into a form of carbon offset. I I think what we've concluded is actually there's a difference between offset, which is difficult to achieve, and a carbon financing, which organisations like us would want to encourage. And I think what we feel in the end is we want to do both. We want to be encouraging the things that we know about. We know about housing, and we know about reducing carbon in housing, but that is not the same as offsetting. And if we're not able to get our own emissions down to zero, which I suspect we won't be, we've got to have something in addition. So carbon financing and carbon offsetting to get us to that sort of final bit down to zero.
So what do we look for? Just picking up on Karen's question there, the importance of using authentic offsetting schemes and where to find them. And is it a case of sort of Googling gold standard and going to people who offer offsets within that, or what? How do people approach that? Jonathan, any thoughts?
It's it's a bit of a cowboy industry, right? Offsetting's doubled. The demand for offsets have doubled in the last year, and you can get different vintages of offsets as well. So you can get credits that have been generated 10, 20 years ago that are still out there on the market that you can buy and retire, and the value of them, I would significantly question. Anything below £5 a ton, I would question. So there's plenty of providers out on the market. Some projects, we always recommend gold standard VCS to provide assurances around that.
But for anybody who doesn't know, that's the voluntary carbon standard, isn't it?
Yes.
If you Google that, if you literally Google that, it'll take you to sites where there will be a list of certified offset providers. That's right, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are some available, and then depending on demand, it's a classic supply and demand thing. Some will be more expensive than others. I know in the UK, if you want to set in using UK Woodland Code, for example, they can't be generating the credits quickly enough for the amount of demand, which is great. It's what we need. And natural carbon sinks and the role that nature has to play in solving this crisis is going to be fundamental. So I still think it's better to, if you have got the money to, and you are doing as much as you can in reducing, to invest in offsets that are super credible, because it's better than not doing it. And also carbon financing sounds amazing. And I also love using your skill set and what your expertise are in to drive that particular change in that particular area and create a story around that. So they are out there, but they are in hot demand, and we need more projects on the ground to deliver wide ranges of sustainable development goals as well. Some do are pretty cool as well.
Well, I was just going to ask about that, because it's a question which is always coming up in my mind when people talk about offsets, because usually people have a hierarchy that you do whatever you can yourself, and then through your suppliers, your customers, your scope 3, and then only as an absolute last resort do you offset. So it's the bottom of the hierarchy, like the old reduce, reuse, recycle hierarchy. And I just wondered, because, again, being a bit provocative, but if your interest is in getting the maximum carbon reduction per pound or dollar invested, the maximum bangs for your buck, then might there be a case that actually the right kind of offset, in other words, the right kind of action to enable massive carbon reductions elsewhere, might actually yield much greater benefits overall than squeezing the very last juice out of potential energy efficiency improvements or whatever in your own headquarters? I mean, is there ever a case for saying, rather than looking at what's the most I can do within my own sphere of operations, it should be what's the most I can do with the resources available, full stop? Any thoughts on that? Or
that is a good question. Bit stumped on that one a little bit. I think you can do both. I think you've got to try and make the resource available, and then max. Okay, so you should be doing everything you can on your own patch, right? Especially within your scope 1 and 2, because there are those benefits there of walking the talk. Then, if you make resource available to invest in projects that restore nature, enhance biodiversity, carbon financing, and carbon credits to help you offset, and looking for those most powerful projects that do the most good, but then also create the best story aligned with what you do. So if you're, I don't know, an office supplies company that sells paper, then working with someone like Cool Earth that protects rainforests, and you can't offset through them, but you can mitigate carbon through them by keeping rainforests standing, and creating a story around that, because it's all trees make paper, etc. Then that's really powerful, and that is, arguably a really good bang for your buck. But I don't think there's a straightforward answer, on a black and white answer on that one.
Sure.
Can
Any thoughts, David? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also sort of throwing back another question, because I just wonder if offsets are just too cheap. I mean, I saw something the other day where if you buy a Range Rover, I think you can add 145 quid onto the price of 80,000 or something, and then you can call it a carbon neutral car for its first 80,000 miles. I mean, I just find it difficult to believe that really does equate to zero, and it just feels to me it's all too cheap, and it's so much easier to just spend a few quid on some carbon offsets than actually make some fundamental changes to your business. I mean, we could offset all of our carbon emissions for about £1,000 at the moment, and my trustees wouldn't even notice that on the balance sheet. So it's hardly a driver. If that was a £50,000 cost or something, they would be asking, well, how can you actually drive that number down? Why can't we reduce our carbon instead? But at the moment, it's too easy and it's too cheap.
Just to pick up on a couple of that's very helpful. Pick up on a couple of other questions that are linked to this. Phil Clark again saying, given the likely lag between buying an offset and when that actually leads to removals, like time for a tree to grow, or time for a solar panel to offset the kerosene that people might be burning in India or whatever, is it better to offset 100% now and then reduce that amount each year as you reduce your impact to net zero? And then linked to that, do you think it's better, the kind of plays what David was saying, I'm interested in your comments on this, David. Do you think it's better to invest in carbon reduction technologies within your sector rather than carbon offsetting in general, as it were? David, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think we've concluded we need to do both, because I think we've looked at housing as a source of carbon offsets, and it simply doesn't work. Houses are just too expensive per ton to make it a viable offset, and compared to planting a tree or something like that, it's just too expensive. And I just think, but if you look at global emissions, the amount of emissions which come from building buildings is absolutely vast, and so we've got to do something about that. And so we know something about that, so we can have some impact on it. But that is a separate question from offsetting our own carbon use, and I think we just sort of see the two things as separate, and we want to do both, and we hope that our impact is going to be greater as a result of doing both.
It sounds like we're saying that one of the, that while offset might be a big push in terms of achieving large-scale carbon reductions, at the moment it is suspiciously cheap. But also, if you focus too much on offsetting, you're missing out all the innovation opportunities, and that seems to be, Althea, I don't know if you'd echo that. Seems to be something you were talking about in your own experience, Severn Trent.
Yeah, absolutely. We decided not to buy offsets now, but we could do that and claim we were at net zero. But that wouldn't be real, and we don't feel it's right to go down the offsetting route until we prove we've done everything we can and everything that's reasonable to reduce those emissions. Obviously, we're accountable to our customers. We have to think about the customer bill and how much money they're willing to pay for it. But we need to make these changes at a reasonable value, and I think unless we really push on that innovation route and use the offsets as last resort, and I think they will have a place for us, but unless they're a last resort, I think it'd be too easy to sit back and go, oh, we've kind of done it now. So it'd be nice to do a bit more ourselves, but never mind. Yeah,
I just want to I've got a couple of things. So you mentioned cost, and I want to make sure we cover that before the end, but if somebody wants to give a quick answer to this question about what's the difference, what's meant by and what's the difference between climate positive, climate negative, planet positive, I don't know if somebody wants to give a 20-second answer to that question.
So essentially those things are offsetting X amount or W amount of carbon that your carbon footprint is. For climate positive, for example. Carbon negative, I think, is it Microsoft have gone down that road of they offsetting all of their historic emissions since fruition as well, which is great because they can afford to. So yeah, But I think there needs to be some consistency and clarity on these things, and not allow it to turn into kind of a marketing exercise.
Yeah, sure.
Which
sure.
There is risk of that happening.
Do we think that you mentioned historic responsibility for historic emissions? Do we see that as something which companies, particularly which have been heavy emitters in the past, are going to come under pressure on? I mean, we see now that, for example, people's links to the slave trade in the past is being held up as something which they should perhaps make reparation for now. Do we see that perhaps net zero will start to include stuff before you even thought of having a net zero target?
I just think anything that we can do to be reducing the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere and then actively sequestering what's up in there now is a good thing to do at this point. So yes, if these big companies want to do it, please, by all means, go for it. Are we going to hold you fully accountable for it? Maybe, but let's just get on with it now. So yeah, if they want to, great.
Okay, we've got, I want to get in this question from Olivia Ward about the Scope 3 emissions, because she's looking for some good practical top tips, how to engage with the supply chain to measure Scope 3 emissions for purchased products. Olivia, you're wrestling with Scope 3. Have you got any thoughts on that? Your top tips for engaging with Scope 3?
So I'd say for us, our supply chain is so varied. We have suppliers who are so thoroughly on board on this, and it's absolutely the bread and butter already. Whereas we have other suppliers who aren't measuring their emissions yet and aren't even thinking about it. So we've taken the approach that we're looking at our sort of top emitters first and trying to very much work with them to reduce those emissions, and then sort of go further down in terms of those who are perhaps lower emitters. So far, we've found that most people are very happy to engage in conversation, but what we're trying to do is think very carefully about what we're actually asking them, because it could take your whole life trying to understand all these emissions from all these different companies, and trying to make it as simple as you can for your suppliers to give you the information. The more success you're likely to have. Yeah,
David, you found similar?
So it's a completely different scale of business we're in. We're much smaller, much simpler than Althea's organisation. I think we've found it relatively straightforward, and we've got a relatively small number of suppliers, and the information we've found relatively easy to get. I think what we're trying to do is each year is improve the accuracy of it, but I should think whether we're sort of an accuracy of sort of 5 or 10% out is probably still better to work on that than sort of hold it all back until we've got it perfect.
The good enough question, yes. I want to. We're sort of moving towards the end. I want to, before we do our final poll and turn to you for your top takeaways, the top practical takeaways. I just want to ask about the cost question. Because obviously the first people who have to be persuaded are the finance directors. There's loads of varying estimates of what even the government's 2050 net zero target will cost, ranging from some who say it's going to cost a huge amount, thousands per household per year, to those who'll say, well, actually, it will end up being a negative cost overall because of all the cost savings and efficiency benefits and innovation benefits. So. What's the view at Severn Trent? How do you tackle this? Is it something which is seen as a necessary cost, or is it seen as a cost initially, but then might be an opportunity cost?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it is a necessary cost, and we have the debates over how much our customers should pay now for the future generations. We're a fairly regular business. We have to justify every pound that we take from our customer. So it is a cost, certainly up front. We've gone after all the easy stuff, the sort of energy efficiency and those sorts of things that potentially can save money. But I have to say, I think with now some of our innovation work, we've got potential not just to save money on the way we treat water or wastewater, but also potentially to make more income from some of these renewable products and things in the future. So I think initially definitely a cost, but I think there's a lot of potential out there as well, and you start to think differently about these things.
So it's an investment cost for stuff you should be doing anyway. Is that would the rest of the panel share that, David, Jonathan? Do you think it can be made out to be an investment investment cost rather than an entirely boring cost?
Yeah, I think for us it's been a mixture of savings and costs, which probably balance themselves out. I mean, I think the bigger issue for us has not just been the financial cost, but actually demonstrating to our trustees that we're going to be able to do this and still have the same impact as an organisation. And I think that's been the bigger challenge for us than finance. But you know, I think both of them we can do, and we can do without an overall cost in the long term, although there will be investment costs at the beginning.
Okay, we've got a nice little a bit of politics, as Ben Elton used to say. A question here. I'll just cover off before we do our final poll and wrap up. You know, we've got the government having to bail out key industries, or one in particular, over the gas price issue. Should the government also intervene to subsidise high emitters that are essential / national interest, so they can drive down emissions more quickly? So, you know, the government's already trying to bail out the steel industry at various times. Should it be bailing it out more so that it can decarbonise more swiftly? Is this going to be part of what the government has to do as part of the overall net zero drive? Anybody?
I'm quite sceptical about this, and I think you know, my sort of knowledge of this is comes from the housing business and what it has said to government previously about, if you bail us out with this or subsidise this, then this will happen, and those sort of benefits somehow seem to evaporate, and I'm just sceptical about it. And I just think, you know, with COVID, we have an opportunity to reset some of the thinking, and I'd like to see the government doing more of that. It seems to be more focused on keeping the economy unaffected than using this as an opportunity to drive down emissions.
Okay, right. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go to our final poll, if I may. Press the magic poll button, and the poll will magically appear. And it's all about innovation, setting a target that you don't know how you're going to achieve it. So innovation technology constantly evolving. I would say, is it okay to set your net zero target without knowing how you'll achieve it? You could even, yes, a big majority in favour of that. And I think that's almost the point sometimes of setting a target. You don't know how you're going to achieve it, because it drives innovation, a bit like Althea was saying. Right, a minute each, please. Just if you can give us your top three tips, three-ish tips. Somebody is wrestling with operationalizing a net zero target. What are the most important practical things for them to do? We'll go in reverse order. So I'm going to start with Jonathan, if I may.
I would say make a pledge. I'm going to plug we're doing a tour of the country at the moment called a Zero Carbon Tour in the Carbon Battle Bus. If you go to zerocarbontour.com, we're one of 10 UN-backed Race to Zero companies collecting the pledges to feed into COP in November. And then get measuring, right? And don't be overwhelmed by the level of complexity, because once you get your head around it, it's fairly simple. So let's roll our sleeves up and get on with it is my message.
Okay. Althea, your top tips.
So I'd say particularly for larger organisations, don't keep your carbon targets, if you've got them, as something completely separate. Try and embed it in everything else you do and get it across all your teams, all your people, and make it absolutely as business as usual as you can. And also I'd say, if you are looking at scope 3, particularly sort of in terms of engaging with suppliers, try to look for ways of trying to get hold of that data in perhaps a standardized way across your industry, so that you're not asking for different bits of information from different people and not getting inundated with requests hundreds of times. I think the more we can standardize some of this, the better chance we have of getting the data that we need.
Lovely, thank you. And David.
Yeah, I would just say, make sure you've got a plan. It doesn't have to be a perfect plan, but make sure you've got a plan, and get buy-in. So in our case, as a charity, having trustees fully on board is essential. It's not going to work without having staff on board and not feeling that this is a threat and that this undermines the job that they're doing. I think was really important. But also be able, give yourself room to flex on that plan. You can't know, nobody knows the future, and having a plan doesn't mean that you have to stick to everything rigidly. You have to have some flexibility about it, and also measuring just is so important. You don't know whether you're on track unless you measure regularly, and that, in our experience, wasn't anything like as difficult as we thought it was going to be.
Okay, so it sounds like a sort of pledge, plan, measure, and infuse, get it out there across the whole company, and make use of that, harvest all that energy that there is among the staff. Right, it's exactly 4 o'clock, so that's the time we scheduled to wrap up. So thank you very much to Jonathan and David and Althea for sharing your insights. Thank you to Karen and Steve for keeping it running behind the scenes. And thank you to everyone who's been with us. I hope you found it immensely useful. There's lots more stuff around sustainability and general tips on the Global Good website, so do go and have a look at that. And we'll see you soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.